this computer. And now I know it's recording because it says recording up there. So
yeah, it said on my screen too.
Yes.
So we're good.
So good afternoon. Anybody have any questions just in general about the class? Okay.
I do.
Okay.
Can you kind of give us a sort of an idea of the pathway that we're taking with this persuasive argument that we've started?
Well, not more than I've said, really. And we'll talk a little bit about this argument in Kairos. We're going to talk about Kairos today, and then we'll talk about the argument in Kairos.
Okay.
Basically, I'm thinking of it as like a sandbox to play with as we learn these new concepts. Just, you know, what do these concepts mean in practice for your writing, and how do you adapt? So the first two chapters are about rhetorical situation and Kairos. And so what would that mean in terms of your own writing? Did you think about the rhetorical situation when you were writing these little rants or opinion pieces or whatever?
Somewhat.
Colleen shook her head no.
Yeah, I had to think about it too. I really wasn't considering that probably like I should have been.
No, I didn't tell you to. So what was the actual rhetorical situation of you writing those opinion pieces?
Part of it was because it was an assignment.
Exactly. I mean, you know, sometimes we talk about school versus the real world as if school is not a real world. I mean, it is a real world. Rhetorical situations happen in school. And the most common rhetorical situation that you are put in as a student is that somebody tells you to write something, and so you do. And no matter what we try to do, you are always thinking about the audience as the teacher. And you are always thinking about your purpose. What would be your purpose when writing anything to your teacher?
To get a good grade.
To get a good grade, yes. To show off, to demonstrate how wonderful you are. And that really impacts, you know, what you can learn. And I mean, it just is part of the reality. Now, we try over and over to give you real situations and encourage you to envision yourself being in a real situation and writing. And the reason we do that, and there again, I said a real situation, but a non-university situation. The reason we do that is because the ultimate purpose of you learning all this is so when you're graduated, you can go out and produce things in other contexts. And to some extent, if you just keep thinking in the mindset of the teacher-student rhetorical situation, you'll be in trouble, you know? And so we're trying to help you practice these different things. Anyway, so I'm going to ask you to think about each of these concepts and then think about what that means for your particular piece. And so what I'm going to ask you is to imagine what would be a rhetorical situation in which you could talk about this, not as a class assignment, but to a real audience, non-university audience. Well, could be a university audience if that's their situation. So that's where we're going with this. Now, in a couple weeks, I'm going to ask you to also think about, pick some piece of rhetoric of some kind and practice with that. And in that case, then you'd be doing something, then I'm going to ask you to do something more like what is done in the book, which is analyzing the rhetoric of something. And I'll do the same kind of thing, pick something. Just like, you'll probably get sick of Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail because they use it as an example in everything, along with the two advertisements for cars at the back. And so they basically practice each of the concepts in analyzing them. And it's just a learning practice, a learning experience. So that's where we are. We're just gonna kind of plug through, learn each of these concepts. Now, and then apply them to your own writing. And then as we go on, pick something that you can apply it to. Now, both of these, the opinion piece and the rhetorical analysis of something, they are just sort of practice things until towards the end of the semester when I'm going to ask you to pick one of those and really make it the best thing you could make it. And that will be what you turn in for a grade on that writing. Now, I'll be evaluating the blogs as we go along. I haven't started trying to clarify for my own head how to. It's easier for grading within Blackboard if you keep doing separate blogs, but I don't really want you to do that. So I have to figure this out. Probably what I'll do, may just I know what I'll do. I'll have a separate column. That's what I'm going to do. Okay, got it figured out. So I'll start grading then. Okay, so let me share my screen. All right, today's theme is going to be Kairos. Tomorrow's or Wednesday's theme will be the rhetorical situation. And Morgan, are you there? You okay? I'm going to assume you're okay. Okay. So today's theme is going to be Kairos. Can you believe it's February? Oh. So in my schedule, I called the topic, why is everyone taking a knee now? This is an allusion to Colin Kaepernick. Everybody know who I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So what happened when Colin Kaepernick first started taking a knee at the anthem, the singing of the anthem in the football league?
He was responding to a profound rhetorical situation.
Yeah, so what happened to him?
Well.
Does everybody know?
Yeah.
Yes? No? How, does somebody want to explain what happened literally what happened to him?
Somebody?
Anybody? So that everybody knows?
I will if nobody else will.
Okay.
So me?
So he is a pretty good football player.
Yeah, he's a real good football player, and he just felt like someone needed to take a leadership role and call attention to some social justice issues that affect that affect people of color, and especially with regard to the way law enforcement approaches people of color with a different mindset.
So he took at the national anthem, and I think this was 2015, 2014. At the national anthem, he started taking a knee rather than standing for the national anthem. People responded mostly negatively. Well, the owners responded negatively by saying that if other players did that, they'd be fired. Colin, I don't think he was literally fired, but he like when he became some kind of thing, he lost his option or something, I don't know. So he was unemployed for a while. I think Trump talked about it. Everybody, they thought he was insulting the flag and the national anthem, and it was un-American. What was his argument? Was it American?
Yeah, he was especially in his mind, he was calling for justice and calling for us to be the people in the country that we say we are.
So let me ask y'all, were you aware of what was going on? So we've got 5 people here. So Jay obviously was aware. Anna, were you aware of what was going on?
I kind of knew, but like I knew kind of the general thing, but I didn't know the specifics.
You didn't know the specific. Are you a football watcher? You watch a lot of football?
I don't.
Colleen, were you aware of what was going on?
Just the basics of it.
Did you have an opinion at the time?
I agreed with him. I was kind of annoyed about everyone being like, stand for the flag, kneel for the cross. And like, they still do it. They slap it on the
There
bumper
for the
sticker.
flag, kneel for the cross. Is that what people said?
Yeah. They try to make the argument about something else.
Right. How about you, Morgan? Were you aware?
Yeah, my dad watches football.
Did he have an opinion?
Yeah, well, he's very liberal, so he was obviously for Kaepernick.
So he supported it?
Yeah.
What did he think about how Kaepernick was treated? Did it bother him?
Well, I mean, yeah, well, he was kind of like saying, you know, he kind of expected it. He probably knew what, there was going to be backlash going in, so he kind of knew some of the consequences. But he was talking about how, like, it's crazy how his own community kind of turned on him, and like he got all this backlash, and it shouldn't even been that big of a deal.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to I want you to hold this question in the back of your mind. And towards the end of class, I'm going to ask everybody the answer to think about why everybody's taking a knee now. Because what happened is this year, somewhere in 2020, people started taking a knee at every sporting event, and it became accepted. So we're going to talk about Kairos. Kairos is an idea that's kind of been re-emphasized since in the last 40, 50 years. Aristotle and Cicero, Aristotle, probably the most important of the Greeks on rhetoric, and Cicero, most important of the Romans on rhetoric, they didn't pay that much attention to Kairos. At the time, it was handled by, or it was introduced and talked about by a group called the Sophists, who include people like Socrates and Pythagoras. That is the same person as the Pythagorean theorem, you know, about triangles. And, you know, at the time of classical time, there weren't that many disciplines, but mathematics and philosophy were two of the most important ones. So we have here my version one time of the rhetorical triangle, and I really actually think I want to edit the picture, but if you know anything about Aristotle, you probably know that he introduced this idea of the rhetorical triangle of logos, ethos, and pathos, representing the three parts of the communication situation, meaning the speaker, the audience, and the message. And he did not talk that much about Kairos. And when he talked about the three types of appeals, he talked about ethos, pathos, and logos. He didn't talk about Kairos, which now is sometimes talked about as a fourth type of appeal. And Cicero, who's basically dealt with rhetoric by classifying it into these 5 canons, and then he could deal with each one of these things. He didn't, you know, you don't see much about Kairos or the situation in these. I'm simplifying. But it was the Sophists like Socrates and Pythagoras who emphasized the importance of Kairos and rhetoric. And as you saw in the textbook, Kairos is a term for time. And there's generally an opposition between Chronos, which is like linear ordinary time, and Kairos, which is a more intense type of time. And Kairos is seen as this opportune moment. Sometimes it's seen as a window, so that it's interesting to think about any of these concepts, to look at the metaphors that they use to describe it. So the metaphor about Kairos is often the window of opportunity, like this, you know, you reach into this particular moment. And it also has to do with appropriateness, appropriate for this time. This is the appropriate manner. To tell you the truth, and I've got this in my triangle here, Aristotle kind of talked about it more like decorum, as in you're appropriate for the audience and the purpose and the situation, which is kind of a not as rich a concept as Kairos. And I think that's why 20th century we've adapted it. In the textbook on page 9, the authors talk about Kairos as the literal occasion for discourse. That is the actual situation in which you are delivering this speech or giving this talk or writing this document or writing a letter or posting a Twitter tweet or posting on Instagram or posting on Facebook. The actual occasion, what triggers you to do that? And then secondly, it is also the surrounding conditions that present opportunities for rhetoric, for communication, for doing things. So a couple of days ago, my uncle died. He was 98 years old. And I almost never go into Facebook, but I posted on Facebook because I looked around, I couldn't find any obituary, and the only obituary was my cousin's posting on Facebook. So I decided to go into Facebook and post my memories of my uncle. And I also posted a bunch of pictures. And so there was a literal occasion for my communication. And I had a purpose to share my memories, to think for myself about him, and to hopefully comfort his family, although they're kind of weird, so I don't know if they were comforted. But also, there is the surrounding conditions that present opportunities. So 20 years ago, if somebody died, I would not have had the opportunity to go into Facebook. If I wanted to reach out to the family, I would have had to do something else. Send a letter, send an email. 20 years ago, email probably would have worked. Call on the telephone. Send flowers or a card. So thinking about the Kairos is both the actual pragmatic, actual moment when you are going to do something. So if I were to go in and post in 2 years from now, that probably wouldn't be a good time. As long as I was thinking about obituaries, I was trying to find my uncle's obituary. There's a really close family friend that I'd been wondering about. So I decided I'd check for that obituary. And lo and behold, I found that the husband of this family friend, again, these people are in their late 80s, 90s, husband died in February 2019, and the wife died in May 2020. And it's a little too late to go in to their obituary and express condolences. I mean, so sometimes it's too late to do something. But so I was thinking that I would, and I will do this, is I'm going to write an email to their daughter, who is my good friend, that I just found this out, because the timing is too late for the immediate thing, but certainly it's appropriate to when you find out something. I was, last class I had the 2 sides of rhetoric, and I was thinking this is also really 2 sides. So it's the actual occasion, but then there are these conditions that create opportunities, that present opportunities. So there's a famous picture of Kairos. This was by Francesco Salviati in the 16th century. And here's this big panel. I think this was in a church. It may be now just in a museum. But he is basically an angel and is conveyed. But I have a close-up over here of his head. As you see, he has a whole lot of hair coming up the front. And this is his forelock. And this is how Kairos, the Greek god Kairos, was often conveyed. as somebody with these things that you can grab onto from his head, and you see over here by his feet. And this is where the phrase, "you can seize time by the forelocks," comes from. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that phrase. It doesn't seem it's that common anymore, but that's where it comes from. It's this idea of grabbing something by the forelocks before it passes you by. So he's flying by. Presumably he was fast. And the idea is before he gets too far, you grab him and you do something in this opportunity. There's a modern communication theory that talks about affordances, how there are affordances in the environment that make things possible. So if we had a pandemic 100 years ago, well, there was a pandemic 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. And they apparently said, you know, stay home, socially distance, wear masks. But what that meant at that time was you just stayed home and you didn't work and things couldn't happen. And schools were shut and et cetera, et cetera. But now we have so much technology that we are able to at least attempt to work from home. And in some situations, this works better than others. So, you know, I think for many types of higher ed, the more humanities, language-based, this is a way that we can teach fairly successfully, you know, if we spend a lot of time to learn how to do it. But for those K-12, you know, like K to 3-year-old, I just can't really imagine that there's any way that we can, that there's affordances in the environment that would make it worthwhile. Maybe someday in the future when we have holographic stuff and, you know, the teacher can become a hologram right in front of the student. But right now we don't have the technologies that are available. And when I hear the word affordances, I think often of Aristotle's point, which I mentioned last class, that persuasion is you use all the available means of persuasion. So an affordance is something that is in the environment that, you know, is not human, but is there. And it often is technology. It could be things going on. It could be another event. It could be an occasion that happens. So, and it affords the possibility to do something. Now, under that, I wrote this line, take the opportunity, make the opportunity. And we use both of those verbs in this phrase. We can say, I want to take the opportunity to do something, as if, you know, the opportunity is out there and, you know, I just take it. And so I'm going to do this. Or we can make the opportunity to do something, in which case the opportunity is not out there, but I create the opportunity. And that's one of the things to think about with Kairos. That is that it's both an occasion and an opportunity. So here's these occasions and they happen. But we also sometimes can persuade people because we've convinced them that now is the right time to do X, Y, and Z. And this is what the authors are talking about with King in his letter. So his letter to the ministers from Birmingham jail the situation around that is this is towards the middle, towards the end of the civil rights movement. And they are beginning to make these nonviolent protests. Well, these nonviolent protests, like sitting in a having a sit-in at a Woolworths, or all going onto a bus, turn violent and angry, and people who are against them are upset. And so the white ministers that King was responding to were saying, slow down, we don't want to make such a big fuss. Just if you slow down a little and stop taking these actions, then it's going to work out in the long run. You don't want to antagonize everybody along the way. We support civil rights, they're saying, but now is not the time to, start making a big fuss about it and fighting. And so King sort of starts with the assumption, okay, yes, I understand why it's not the time. But by the end of his letter, he has basically criticized the ministers for not seeing that it's the time. And I wanted to read this section from the book. So he's been, they've been talking. The ministers wrote something called A Call for Unity. And at the end of his thing, he says, those people have failed to live up to the ideals that you as ministers are expected to embrace. Thus, we see that King has set up his critics as representative of a position that his intended audience is asked to reject as morally, politically, and religiously wrong. Our point is that King cannot begin with such arguments because the initial kairos of his situation was wrong for them. He cannot at first respond to criticisms that he is an extremist whose methods are unwise and untimely by declaring, "You hypocrites, God and our nation's heritage is on my side," although he may have been kind of wanting to do that. He cannot do so because the intended audience likely doubts his own moral standing and the justifiability of his methods. Notably, his opening paragraph does not even suggest that he will turn against his critic in the letter's second half. There is no announcement or forecast of what is to come, probably because such an announcement would be premature and would only provoke resistance in his audience. Since King had ample opportunity to revise the letter and did revise it, one can assume that this non-mention was a deliberate strategic choice. The kairos, however, has been altered by the time King gets to paragraph 23. At that point, he can begin to criticize his critics because his reply has created the conditions for him to do so. This fact is probably why most analyses of Letter from Birmingham Jail tend to focus on the first half. It does most of the rhetorical heavy lifting and not so coincidentally contains some of the most memorable passages in modern American literature. So the point is that, yes, kairos is the actual situation that they're in, but the rhetoric that you create can, through the temporal progression of your own rhetoric, can try to change the argument and change your audience so that they can become able to listen to the argument. So actually, I started by saying Aristotle wasn't that interested in Kairos. And really, he really was. It's just that he didn't like the sophists because they were sort of mercenary rhetoricians. The sophists were basically speakers for hire who, if you paid them enough money, they would go give a speech on whatever topic you wanted. And so Aristotle didn't like that because of that. What that implied is that good speaker, you don't have to believe in what you're saying, you just have to be a good speaker. In any case, Aristotle does say things about that relate very much to Kairos. He says, now we praise a man who feels anger on the right grounds and against the right persons, and also in the right manner and at the right moment and for the right length of time. So sometimes I like to think about what would be my superhero if super skill, superpower, if I was a superhero. If I was a superhero, this would be my superpower, so that I could feel anger on the right grounds against the right persons, which is fine, but also in the right manner, at the right moment, and for the right length of time. How many times have you had the experience where you've been in some kind of discussion with something, and somebody says something and you don't really know how to respond, but later you think, oh, I should have said X, or this is what I should have said. And that is a rhetorical power, to know what to say at the right time. An interesting thing on a very sort of pragmatic level is how do you work in committees? So how in a committee do you end up saying just the right thing at the right moment for the right length of time in the right manner, so that everybody listens to you and actually does what you want them to do? I spent a lot of time in my life in committees, and I can tell you there's almost nobody who is able to do that. But that's what I aspire to, and I'm sure other people do aspire as well. I like this quote because it's dealing with this anger as opposed to rhetoric. And so maybe it seems like an odd thing to use, but I think it really helps us think about rhetoric and politics, which we know is rhetoric is so much part of politics, so that and activism as well. So this is a description of, how does an activist like Colin Kaepernick make his point, use his rhetoric so that he convinces people of his thing? And the reality is that Colin Kaepernick was too early. Now, maybe he was a necessary preparing step. If he hadn't done what he did before, 3 years later, it would not have been necessary, it wouldn't have the same effect. So this gets me back to my question. Why is everybody taking a knee now? What changed in the Kairos? And so this is, I'd like to talk a little bit about it, what you guys think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like at the time Kaepernick was like the only one, so many people were kind of hesitant to come forward because they're like, well, I don't want to get the backlash he's getting. I mean, he's the only one. But now almost so many athletes are doing it that it's less scary, because it's not like you can't, almost like force LeBron James out of the league and Kevin Durant and all these, you know what I mean, all these players. So these industries are kind of forced to recognize an issue and stand with them rather than against them. I think that's part of the reason.
Why, what was the second person and the third and the fourth persons back in the spring able to do that?
Well, also some of the social movements that have been going on too. The Black Lives Matter, the marches and stuff. It's kind of more than just celebrities doing it. It's actually real people. And these are consumers, so business people are going to be like taking this seriously.
So Black Lives Matter is another good example. And taking the knee is part of the Black Lives Matter sort of movement becoming really important is part of the kairos that enabled all these other people to follow Colin Kaepernick. Why did the Black Lives Matter movement become so strong? When did it start? It's another thing like Colin Kaepernick, where it started a few years ago. Does anybody know?
George Floyd.
Well,
before that too.
Pardon?
Before that, also Philando Castile.
Didn't it kind of start with Rodney King in the 90s, kind of? I'm not sure if that's...
I'm not sure when the phrase was used. I know it started, it was definitely used with the case in Ferguson, Missouri.
Oh.
Forgot the kid's name, but the person who was just gunned down on the street, on the road. So the real triggering point of the Black Lives Matter in this recent time was definitely the Floyd case in Minneapolis. Was that the first Black person unfairly treated and ultimately killed by a policeman? So what triggered it now? What was the moment that made the Floyd case so astounding and so powerful at kind of changing people's thoughts?
You can hear him begging for his life. It's recorded.
It's recorded. Why does that? So that, one of the things is that's an affordance. So one of the affordances in the environment is that the technology has developed so that everybody has a cell phone, well, just about everybody, and video capability on those cell phones is phenomenal. And it was all in public, and within 2 seconds, it was out on social media and, you know, viral across the universe. None of that existed really a couple of years before. I mean, the technology had gotten to the point, and this, you know, the trends towards social media and posting had developed. What else had happened?
You mean like who else had been killed shortly after George Floyd? Or what else had to happen for...
Both. I mean, what are all the sort of events that transpired to sort of bring everybody to a fever pitch of concern?
I mean, you have Tamir Rice, who was only 12 years old. And then you have Breonna Taylor, who was sleeping. They started with stuff like Trayvon Martin, like, oh, well, he looked suspicious and he was doing this and he was trying to make lean, and they had all this, but they couldn't say anything about Breonna sleeping.
Eric, was that one guy's name was Eric? He was
Eric
like out.
Garner.
Yeah, him. That was one too.
I'm sorry, speak a little louder.
Eric Gardner.
Which one was he?
I think he was like selling cigarettes outside of a gas station, and like the cop like sat on his back, or like choked him and he couldn't breathe. He had asthma, and that was kind of a big catalyst also.
Can't breathe. And then the New York cops were wearing shirts saying "We can breathe." They
Yeah.
were making fun of him. That was ooh.
I mean, you know, the fact that we watched him die on video is pretty astounding. And then he had that saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." I mean, it's just a perfectly phrased thing to be taken up as a sort of an anthem, a rhetorical point. What are some of the rhetorical things that have happened after Floyd's death? In the protests, do you know any of the things that usually have happened? One is the "I can't breathe" t-shirt or slogan. Another is the 30-some seconds of silence that people have that parallel the 30-something seconds in which the policeman held him down. And that becomes this rhetorical expression that is, you know, expressing solidarity. What else? Whoops. What else? Why else is the Floyd case, did it really trigger this new protests? What else is going on?
Mm,
In May of 2020. So the Floyd case was Memorial Day weekend. How does the pandemic play into this?
Well, people are already on edge.
You're going to have to get closer to your microphone, I think.
People are already on edge.
So part of the affordances in the environment is that everybody is on edge. Even worse, everyone is scared because there's this virus that's killing people. And many people are sad. What about the pandemic and racial issues?
The virus has been affecting people of color disproportionately.
And they had were at the end of May, that was becoming clear. You know, so it became serious in the middle of March. So from the beginning of pandemic really kind of affecting people across the United States to the end of May, we have March to April to May. We have 2.5 months, basically 10 weeks. And in those 10 weeks, thousands had already died. I don't know what the situation was up in Minnesota and Minneapolis. It certainly wasn't a hotspot, but in a sense, it doesn't really matter because what happened there was immediately broadcast nationwide. And so everybody became aware of it. But by these 10 weeks into the pandemic, there was statistics and data that was coming out that was showing that the health system showed that there are racial disparities in the health system, and then expressed with this recent crisis. What else is going on in May 2020?
The election. I mean,
the election. I mean, what's going on? What's that doing to everybody?
I mean, it's still like right after primary season, so it's not like very close, but it is still making people fight, especially you see on Twitter and everything.
Well, so by that point, we have Biden versus Trump.
Hmm.
We have, of course, Trump as president. What's Trump doing with respect to racial issues?
Just making things worse.
What?
It's making things worse.
Um,
He's not really responding like the community wants him to.
I'm sorry, say that again.
He's not really responding like the community wants him to.
Yes. And this is an interesting thing. When thinking about Kairos, it's interesting to think about certain times when you expect your leaders to do something and to speak appropriately. So when there are disasters, we expect our leaders to comfort the bereaved and to speak in some kind of way. So in many ways, George W. Bush, because of the way he responded to 9/11, and you can go back and look at how he responded, he gained a lot of popularity because he totally had an appropriate way to do that. I think Obama had a really good way of dealing with like gun violence type things. Unfortunately, Trump kind of didn't, instead of soothing people and making them feel better, he tended to take some kind of crisis as an opportunity to kind of fan the flames somehow. It's hard to know
Everything
why.
all about him.
It's all about him, you know. It's hard to understand why, well, if he's really a narcissist, he just can't see outside himself. But, you know, what people needed in this times is people, you know, a calm voice, an inspiring voice. And he did not know how to do that. He did know how to sort of, pick up on a kairos of certain, you know, people talk a lot about how Trump talked to his base. And his base was, you know, a certain segment of the population, generally white males, who were feeling as if there was just too much concern about the other people and not taking advantage, not concern about them. And Trump knew how to take advantage of that kairos as well. So the George Floyd, or the taking a knee thing, so much happened to make it a whole different event by 2020. And so that, you know, so now we have owners supporting Black Lives Matter and owners who, I mean, not all of them, but there's been a whole sort of tipping point. There's been like momentum that happens. And part of what happens with rhetoric is sort of a momentum that builds on itself because people talk and then that they give language for other people and we're all talking together. So I just thought this was kind of amazing because here are two examples that I can use for rhetoric and kairos that happen to come across my computer or radio or whatever. And I thought, wow, this is perfect for talking about kairos. You know how you've heard, you know, things happen for a reason or things happen for the right time, you know, whatever. This is kind of what kairos can start being. Okay, so there is a singer Sophie Fustek, who she's actually known as La Chica, and I've heard of her there. And I happen to just pick listen to the end of her speech, her talk, her interview, Sunday morning. And so
out, and after that, Oi is the song to him to elevate himself.
all right, so she just published a new album called La Loba. And one of the things that happened to her in the last year is her brother died in a tragic accident. And so most of this album is about her brother. That's the context.
Yeah, I mean, some of these songs are almost like meditations. I'm thinking of Agua. Let's listen. Del cielo cae agua, lluvia poderosa, lávame la mente con agua fría. Wash my mind with cold water. Tell me about this song. Yeah, well, agua is a ritual. It's a song for the water. I need to clean. I need a cleaning. I need to clean with water because the water is my element and it's magical. So I'm asking the river to carry on all my pain and my sorrows. This is a period of much death and
so well, let's keep on.
And pain. I'm wondering what you have learned going through this process of grieving for your brother. It's so powerful. I don't know. I don't understand why we don't talk about death.
So one of the things that I thought was just a little interesting about what she was saying was that the process of singing and the process of doing this ritual with water was a cleansing, and it's magical. And there'll be some other phrases later on. And this made me think of the encomium of Helen that we read last week, where the writer says, we can't blame Helen because she was seduced or magically mysticized by rhetoric. So we have metaphors here for rhetoric of song, water, etc.
You should embrace every step of this experience. Do you feel like you were able to connect with him by doing this album? Yes, definitely. I think that I'm able to connect with them through music because music allows you to open another level of consciousness, and the sounds can let you enter into a trance.
And if you want, you could replace the word music with rhetoric and be talking about what Gorgeous was talking about in the encomium.
Trance. Toca mi tercer ojo con tu mente. Toca mi tercer ojo con tu mente. Music to me is some kind of shamanism, and it helps. It, how do you say sanar? It heals. It heals. Thank you. Music heals. And I think that 2020 was a special year. It was a strong year. everywhere, so much death and changes. And I think that these years screamed out that we need a change. We need to enter into this new era with a new level of consciousness. So we heard that voice, and now we have to do something about it, and we have to transform everything that we've been living this year.
So I thought this is what I happened to walk into the room and hear at the end. This is a perfect example of Kairos, how what's been going on in the world seems to have triggered all these ideas, but we need to grab the opportunity by the forelocks and not let it pass, because that's kind of the problem that happens before, is that that anger just dissipates rather than move to action. Here's a second very different example of rhetoric and Kairos. So there's a group, this is just a group of interfaith leaders, pastors, ministers, rabbis, imams, and they decided back in 2017 that they would each write a letter to at that time the new president, Trump, about what was needed. And then it was a very well-received sort of activity. So in other words, they took the opportunity that was facing them to have a voice and to speak out. And then you can subscribe to their whole series. So they decided to do it again this year. They are writing one letter for every 100 years, for the first 100 days of Biden's presidency. So day 0 explains what they're doing. 4 years ago, for the first 100 days of the Trump administration, American values, religious voices sent powerful, insightful letters from a diverse range of religious studies scholars to Trump, Pence, and members of the Congress. The letters challenged our leaders to govern in ways that align with core American values that are connected to our different faith traditions. 4 years later, notice how important time is to their project. This is a project that happens now. No other time is appropriate for this project. 4 years later, we remain convinced of the potential of this grassroots effort to foster civil discourse and bring people together around shared values. So starting on Inauguration Day and continuing for the first 100 days, we will send a letter to our explicit audience, President Biden, Vice President Harris, and members of the Congress. At the same time, the campaign aims to reach a wide, multi-faith, implicit audience, all those who subscribe to Values and Voices or read the letters on our website or through Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So just as a point, they're talking about the parts of the rhetorical situation. Their rhetorical situation is they have an explicit audience, the new leaders, but they have an implicit audience, which is much broader, the whole American community. 4 years ago, some of the most prominent values were justice, care for the stranger and the vulnerable, freedom, love, and compassion. Which values will come to the fore this time? Which messages will you find most meaningful? Which letters will surprise you, inspire you, motivate you to do your part to contribute to the common good? So part of this effort helps us see what exactly are the values at this particular time that people are thinking about. Ministers, the faith leaders, by definition, have to constantly be thinking about the situation. So each week, at least in Christianity and Judaism, there's some kind of sermon that the leader has to give. And it is almost always somehow tied to the actual situation around them. And so, but this time they're dealing with it as a nationwide. So so here's the one from today. No, I think it's, so you can see there are all different kinds of religions represented. Okay, Lisa Bones.
Dear President Biden, Vice President Harris, and members of the 117th Congress. As I write this letter, simultaneous crises exist. A pandemic affects the physical, economic, mental, spiritual, and emotional health of our nation and the world. Over 360,000 Americans have died, bringing immense grief and trauma. The disturbing and frightening scenes of rioters storming Capitol Hill remain emblazoned upon many minds, for such actions threaten this republic's democratic ideals and norms. Racial divisions, which run deep in our nation, continue to plague us like a virus, refusing to die.
Now, notice the metaphor she uses. So the racial divisions is a plague like a virus. Of course, it's obviously selected for this moment in time.
Can Christian scripture speak in such crises? Words do matter. And for Christians, the word matters. John's gospel calls Jesus the Word of God that became flesh and dwelled among us. John 1:14. Jesus, a Jew, lived in the midst of political corruption, deep divides between the rich and the poor, Roman oppression of the Jews, and sicknesses like leprosy for which there was no cure. Jesus' arrival reveals that God comes to humanity in times of crisis, and that God's care for and commitment to humanity and the world remain. Christ is Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. Matthew 1:23. A God who refuses to abandon us in the midst of a world filled with pain, hate, injustice, oppression, and division.
So I'm going to stop there. And the links for this is on the PowerPoint. And I urge you to, if you have time, to read some of these speeches, because so each one of these people were told that they had the right to write one letter to the president, vice president, and Congress. So they had to think about this moment in time, what do I want to see? Now, as you notice that they corrected the number of people who had died. So in the text, it says 400,000 people had died of the pandemic, but apparently she recorded this back when it was 360,000. So sometimes we can't get the kairos exactly right. But so each one of these people thought, okay, what one thing do I want to tell these leaders and the American people right now? You know, and what is the rhetoric that I can use to persuade them of whatever it is that I'm going to persuade them. And it's interesting to me. I'm very interested in different religious viewpoints on things. Because I'm Jewish, I'm married to a Christian, and we've raised our children above. So it's interesting to me to look at the different approaches that different religions take in giving a little letter sermon type thing. That's just an aside. So, but because they develop different rhetoric. I don't know if any of you go to your relative faith organizations, but a minister, a preacher, a rabbi, an imam, they are rhetoricians. They are each week trying to communicate something of importance and respond to the needs of their audience, which is what rhetoric is. And so it's an interesting kind of thing to just take a look at. How does this relate to rhetoric, to Kairos? I mean, she emphasizes time. She is talking about this moment in time and what she thinks is needed. You know, sometimes people talk about if you're in the military or if you've gone through a war, you experience, you know, this intensity of experience that you know, changes you and that is unlike any other thing later. Well, I haven't ever been in a war, so I don't know. But I think they're also talking about Kairos at that. That is, there are points in time when it is more intense what's going on. The environment experiences things that are happening, and that leads to feelings, to thoughts, to emotions, to beliefs. And I mean, as much as I hate what's happened in the last year, from a rhetorician's viewpoint, it's extremely interesting to see how this intensity of combining crises, as she points out, has led to such rhetoric from all different directions. As people try to make sense of the world and help others make sense. So there we are for today. Does anybody have any questions about Kairos and the course?
This was an awesome lecture.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it because I was really sleepy. I did not get enough sleep last night. Kairos is such an awesome concept. So it is, if you Google the word Kairos, it's amazing how much it's used. There are companies using it, and there are TV shows using it. One of the important journals in rhetoric that our own Londi Martin has actually published in is called Kairos. And so it is a really useful thought. And it will be so interesting 20 years from now to look back at this moment in time and to see if things change, because in the moment it feels like things will change on the environment, on racial justice, on other things, but you know, you never know. Because that anger you need to move forward has to be just the right amount at right time, and it may not happen. Okay, so continue reading the first two chapters. I will call on you more to have read the first two chapters on Wednesday. And as I said at the beginning, what I'll be asking you to do in the opinion piece is to think about, okay, who do I want to write to at what moment in time? And if you want, you can pretend that you know, if it's appropriate, you could write something 10 years ago you know, pretend that you're writing 10 years ago, if whatever your topic is. Or you can try to think of yourself as trying to create the time, you know, change people so that they see that it's the time to do something, which is also part of Kairos. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.